Thank you all for joining our virtual symposium this afternoon. I'd like to thank our longtime education sponsor, D.A. Davidson, for the funding and support to help make this discussion possible. I want to let you know that this program has been pre-recorded for quality assurance. However, there will be a Q&A at the close of the recorded session where some of our participants will be able to chat to answer any questions you may have at the close. So this year's symposium topic features the voices of Montana poets from around the state. It's a bit divergent from what we have done in the past, with a focus on literary arts rather than visual, but I think this change of pace offers a refreshing angle through which to interrogate Russell's art and values, as well as a means to highlight the work of prominent Montana artists living today. So what brings us to poetry this year? We all know that Russell was an accomplished storyteller who learned much of his craft observing the storytelling traditions of the open range, the campfire, the teepee ring, and the hearth fire. While he was a latecomer to the so-called Wild West, he inherited its history passed down through the colorful people and their more colorful stories of times gone by, where the fictive often commingled with the truth. Russell knew enough of his craft to say that when it comes to telling a good story, one not ought to stay too close to the truth. Quote, "You like straight goods, but the world don't, and they are the folks that buy books," unquote. And it's in this stretched truth where we find the legendary in Russell's own persona that sold many of his goods. While much of Russell's work contains narrative action or storytelling, when it comes to his poetry, there's a certain intimacy at play that we don't find anywhere else. This is because, unlike his published stories, his poems were crafted, by and large, for an audience of friends, and even more pointedly, written in the spirit of gift-giving. In this same vein, we take Russell at his word when he said, quote, "Between the pen and the brush, there is little difference, but I believe the man that makes word pictures is the greater," unquote. So today, in that same magnanimous way, we look forward to hearing the diverse voices that are with us this afternoon and the gifts of insight they will give us. Our moderator for today's symposium is Robert Stubblefield, a lecturer at the University of Montana teaching creative writing and composition, who also oversees the undergraduate literary magazine, The Oval. He has published fiction and personal essays in Dreamers and Desperados, Contemporary Short Fiction in the American West, Best Stories of the American West, and Hayden's Fairy Review. His most recent work appears in Basalt, High Desert Journal, Southern Humanities Review, and the Whitefish Review. Awards include a Georges and Anne Borchardt Scholarship from the Sewanee Writers Conference, Fish Trap Fellowship, and Imhaha Writers Retreat Fellowship. Robert grew up in Eastern Oregon and now lives in Missoula. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. And I'd like to welcome you all here today. And we're pleased to be here with four of Montana's favorite poets. And we're including three poet laureates, past and present. So the poets joining us today are Chris Latreille, and Chris is a writer and a walker. His first book, One Sentence Journal, Short Poems and Essays from the World at Large, won the 2018 Montana Book Award and 2019 High Plains Book Award. His next book, Becoming Little Shell, will be published by Milkweed Editions in spring 2021. Chris is Chippewa Cree Métis and is an enrolled member of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians. He lives near Missoula, Montana. Our second panelist today is Mandy Smoker, and Mandy, along with Melissa Kwasny, is a current co-poet laureate for the state of Montana. Mandy belongs to the Assiniboine and Sioux tribes of the Fort Peck Reservation in Montana. She holds an MFA from the University of Montana in Missoula, where she was the recipient of the Richard Hugo Fellowship. Her first collection of poems, Another Attempt at Rescue, was published by Hanging Loose Press in 2005. In 2009, she co-edited an anthology of human rights poetry with Melissa Kwasny entitled I Go to the Ruined Place. She received a regional Emmy Award for her work as a writer-consultant on the PBS documentary Indian Relay. Mandy served as Director of Indian Education for the state of Montana for almost 10 years. In 2015, she was named the Indian Educator of the Year by the National Indian Education Association and was appointed to the National Advisory Council on Indian Education by President Barack Obama. She currently works at Education Northwest as a practice expert in Indian education. Our third panelist, also a former poet laureate, a recent poet laureate for the state of Montana, is Michael Earl Craig. Michael Earl Craig's most recent book of poems is Woods and Clouds, Interchangeable. His other books are Talkativeness, Thin Kimono, Yes, Master, Can You Relax in My House, and the chapbook, John Bang Jet. And our fourth panelist today is Tammy Holland. Tammy is the author of 3 poetry collections, What Does Not Return, When We Wake in the Night, and Breath in Every Room, winner of the Nicholas Rorschach First Book Award. Her poems have appeared in many periodicals and anthologies, including Ascent, Consequence, the American Journal of Poetry, the Eco Poetry Anthology, and Healing the Divide. Her work has been featured on the Writer's Almanac, Verse Daily, American Life in Poetry, and The Slowdown. And Tammy served as Montana's Poet Laureate from 2013 to 2015. She's received a Governor's Humanities Award, an Artist Innovation Award from the Montana Arts Council, and has been a writing resident at the Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center. She was one of many artists who collaborated with the UK filmmaker Anna Cady on her Elemental Dialogue series, which was shown at festivals and other venues in England and Scotland. Holland is a professor of creative writing and literature at Montana State University in Billings. So that's a long list of awards and accomplishments, and congratulations to all of you, and thanks for your generosity and time and preparation for appearing today on the panel. And I'd like to thank the C.M. Russell Museum for hosting us virtually, I guess, but and particularly to Eileen for coordinating all of this and assembling this impressive passel of poets. I wish we were meeting in person, but I'm happy to be joining all of you in any format. And I think over the past few months, we've once again realized the importance of letters and correspondence, which is our main topic today. So much of our world right now has been and continues to be virtual that I think the tangible and visceral connection of art, of writing, canvas and paper possibly feels more valuable than ever. It seems like I've been receiving and sending more postcards and letters than I have for years. And I'd like to hear how all of you are keeping in touch and keeping things real in a world that has become somewhat virtual recently. And our primary source of material for this discussion is your friend, C.M. Russell, the C.M. Russell Museum Collection of Illustrated Letters. And it's a beautiful book that informs, surprises, and delights on every page. Walt Kuhn said, "One should never forget that the power of words is limited." But isn't the inverse also true? And I'd like to kind of open by thinking about what did Russell communicate in verse and letters that was perhaps lacking or maybe open to misinterpretation through the visual art. And I think we all have this image when we hear Charlie Russell's name. And I think being able to look at the letters, the poems, the correspondence, some of that prose added to that and puts that in maybe a more complete context. So I just kind of like to open that up to the poets and hear what your initial and lasting impressions were of going through some of those poems, the correspondence, and the letters.
I'll answer first. I think kind of to draw the parallel between what we talk about the virtual world and how we communicate. You know, I look at these letters with his drawings included in the letters, and how much kind of a gift that is because it's so personal. You know, I doubt at the time that the people who were receiving these letters ever imagined that they were going to be something that were going to be of value or that people would want to collect at some point. And we think about that like with writers today, with so much of our communication, or any artists, being electronic and emails. Who wants to publish a bunch of printed out emails? Whereas in a situation like this, you've got Russell's letters, so we're seeing his personality through his writing, as well as the little sidebar drawings and sketches and things that he included. And that's so much, you know, like today, you know, we can share a picture with someone and then turn around and share it to the rest of the world. And I think it loses some of that intimacy. You know, I know if somebody sends me a picture, you know, from our hike or a selfie or whatever, it's more meaningful if I know it just came to me. And maybe that's an ego thing on my part. I don't know, but I just think there's a cool factor in direct one-to-one communication that I think lacks when we just kind of blast it out for everyone to see. And that's so easy to do, right? I could do it right now. I could take a picture of my computer screen and say, hey, look at me with a bunch of poet laureates, you know, look, Mom. And, you know, they couldn't do that. I guess that's my initial thought anyway.
In his letters, in particular, you know, just the fact that he, you know, would create illustrations to accompany each one of them. Those were incredibly, you know, beautiful pieces of artwork in and of themselves. I guess in those letters, what I was, I think, most surprised by, I guess, knowing, you know, kind of his rugged cowboy image, just the tone of loneliness that they conveyed at times. You could just sense that he had a hearkening for home and for his friends and for those more direct communications. You know, he would really avoid talking about the present circumstances, knowing that he might be in Chicago or New York or Florida or California, and how little how little detail he included about those places, other than, you know, usually a disdain for the industry and for the overcrowdedness and you know, the things he was experiencing in those cities, in contrast to what he loved so much about Montana, and its openness and its people. I really just, the sense that he was a person who really valued human connection, and almost as if he needed a sort of validation from those friendships, and that those letters were kind of seeking out that validation, was just really something that I would have never, you know, been able to really gather from his artwork alone.
Thanks, Mandy. Something that Chris brought up that I'd like to ask you as poets and as correspondents is the fact that so much of our correspondence today is electronic. What do you think archives will look like in the future? Do people actually print out emails? And I was thinking about something that William Kittredge said one time, because somebody said, well, do you keep letters? And he said, why would you write a letter to anyone who would throw it away? And I thought that's kind of true. What do you think we'll have when we collect these archives from contemporary writers and artists?
It seems that I think probably a lot of writers and maybe writers and artists are saving emails, and even, I don't know how text chains will be accessed, but I don't save things because I think someday I might be famous or someday my friend might be famous, but just I think I try to save with certain friends of mine correspondence just the same way that I did in the 90s, before I had a computer, before I had a phone, for sure, playing on the phone almost all, it's just too much, you know, using the phone. So I don't know if other people feel that way too, but back to your question, I don't know how it's going to happen. Like, I mean, in terms of texting and email, it seems like it could both be very complicated, but maybe it's going to be a lot easier than we think, because you know, we're told that everything that happens on the computer, you know, it's stored somewhere, and that's kind of interesting. So maybe it'll be easier than we think. I'm not sure. But one other quick thing, back to what Chris was saying about, I love that bit in the book where Albert and his wife Margaret Trigg, they have, I'm looking at 4 or 5 different Christmas or New Year's cards, and it's implied somewhere in the text that they didn't all come to their house, which means she was probably over having coffee at a neighbor's, and they were getting ready to discard one of these, because to them, this hand-done card was fun to have for a few days or a week in the house, but at some point it's just going to go in the trash. And I think the Triggs definitely did see the value, like kind of what we're talking about. The Triggs were curating even then, if I'm reading this correctly. Is that how you guys were seeing that?
Yeah, I think I saw it that way too. I mean,
Yeah.
Certainly they were close and understood the value of his work. The cards remind me a little bit of Ben Steele's cards. He would make special cards for Christmas too. But in terms of the letters, yes, I think authors do print out and/or save emails, but I also think it's so easy to lose them in the, just sort of cacophony of email that comes in every day. And
Yeah.
so I don't know how organized a lot of us might be. And I think, I love seeing the handwriting of writers. So I have really treasured letters that I've received that are handwritten, or at least the signature line is there. And it's one thing that I've loved historically too, is seeing the handwriting of authors from, 200 years ago. There's something sort of magical about that. And I don't think we'll have that so much anymore.
Right, yeah.
One thing Mandy brought up, that we see a side of Russell in the letters and occasionally in the poems that we might not initially be aware of. And I think there's a lot of nostalgia and humor and some of the more formal of the poems have an elevated diction, but he's really clear, direct, and kind of concise in those occasional poems. And I found those really interesting when he was writing kind of directly to his audience was evident. And there was more humor in there than maybe I initially would have expected.
Well, there's quite a bit of humor in some of his paintings too, though. I think humor must be a big part of his character.
I guess there's a sentimentality and kind of an openness that I might have initially overlooked, and especially with the emphasis on the holidays and the rituals, those Lake McDonald outings. And I think the domestic life is given a little bit greater role in that than we might initially perceive through the paintings.
I think, I would say, maybe the painting sometimes that was the job, and the stuff that he's writing, and drawing and illustrating for cards and things is maybe what he does for fun. That might be kind of an oversimplification, but I know like I feel a lot more unfettered in the stuff that I do that I know I'm never going to worry about going back and editing it or where it's going to fit in other things I'm working on. And maybe that is part of, where his personality, he allows himself to show it a little more in that context than maybe he felt he could as an artist. I've never read any of his biographies or anything like that, so I don't really know, what his relationship to his artwork was, but just trying to extrapolate that from my own experience and the work that I'm doing, whether it's for a magazine or for, a work in progress, whatever, that definitely has a different feel to me than the correspondence that I do with my friends. And I'm just curious if there's anybody else here in this group that is doing any of the analog correspondence that we're talking about at all, or if it's all electronic.
A quick question for you, Chris, is does that kind of correspondence ever inform your work that you're doing for, for publication or anything? Does it ever serve as kind of a portal for that?
I think it can. I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't say that there's been times I've written to someone and thought, yeah, that's a good idea. I'm gonna put that one in my notebook too, So yes, for sure. Or, I do a lot of journaling too. And some of that will show up as I process things, will show up in maybe a letter to somebody, or it might show up in poetry or prose pulled from that initial place that was just for me to work my thoughts out, through my hand. Right. So yeah, for sure. And maybe it was the same for him.
Yeah, I find, so I got my first computer in 2005, which is maybe a little bit late to the game, but so all through the 90s and early aughts, I was, to what you were saying, Chris, loved writing letters, had friends I would write letters. Most of it was done on a typewriter, and because I enjoy typing, and my handwriting, I always feel is worried that it's not legible. But what I was going to say is almost always when I would pick one person, it's not a Facebook blast where you're trying to communicate with a bunch of strangers, but you're talking to your friend Scott or to your friend Martha or whoever it is. And I would be writing about something that happened that day or that weekend carefully, and then I would usually run it through a draft or two. This is how I wrote all my letters. I'd type it out fast, scribble all over it, cross things out, fix it up again. I would try not to beat it to death, but in the end, almost always there was a passage somewhere which was a description of something, a description of winter, of something that I'd eaten, of an animal, whatever it is, that would go into a poem later, almost always. And so it became a sort of a prompt for me in those years where I would know that if I would write a letter to my parents or to a friend, I would get in the zone and I would be basically unearthing things that would no doubt go on to and sometimes the last thing I'll say on that is there were times where the bulk of the letter was that document, and I would not send the letter, or I would think about not sending the letter because it would basically be the poem. So that's it. That's I think some of this stuff, I wonder, all of us are old enough that we know all about what I just said. I'm sure all of us did that and lived that way. And when I'm interacting with people in their 20s, I do wonder, I think that they will, I'm not saying they won't miss it because they didn't know it. They'll just be doing something else with their correspondence. And that maybe would be interesting to hear more about.
See, I love it. I love, like on my rush home to do this, I check the mail and I've got a card in my bag from a friend in Washington that I can't wait, to wrap this up so I can read this card. I just think there's a level of magic to that kind of correspondence. And maybe it seems greater now because we just don't do it as often. But I love it. The older I get, the more I love analog stuff. And there's nothing more analog than a letter going through our beleaguered postal service,
Yeah.
Well, Mandy, I mentioned in the introduction that you were the Richard Hugo Fellow when you were here at the University of Montana. And I know that you have a series of poems that are presented as letters to Hugo. And I thought this might be a great time for you to share one or more of those if you were willing to.
Sure, I'd love to read those Hugo poems. One thing I did want to say about writing letters is my son is entering third grade, and he spent much of second grade learning cursive, and just how beautiful that was as an experience as a parent to watch him engage with his voice, so deliberately and with such intention, what it takes to write out each letter and each word, really like a slowing down of language. And it reminded me of all the letters from my grandmother, who passed away probably about 15 years ago now, and how much I looked forward to those, and not so much for the content, but just to feel a connection through her very, deliberate cursive. And, those are almost artworks in and of themselves to me. So yeah, I actually enjoy writing letter poems. They are something, I learned distinctly by reading Richard Hugo's work. I wish I had written this poem with my own hand, but in all honesty, it came from a computer in my home office when I lived in Missoula and was still actually going to school. So this is called Letter to Richard Hugo. Dick, the reservoir on my end of the state is great for fishing. Some of the banks are tall and jagged, others are more patient, taking their time as they slope into rocky beaches. If you were the kind of fisherman I imagine, then you might have considered it a great place to cast from. My family has gone up there ever since the water on the Mini-Chaussee was dammed off. My grandparents put on their moccasins and beadwork and danced for FDR when he rode the train out to see the finishing touches of this great industrial project. I haven't yet decided if this is something I wish to be proud of. Maybe this summer I'll spend more time up there on the edge of a lake that was never meant to be a lake and form an actual opinion. Maybe too, I'll write you again, but you have probably already figured as much. I almost thought of not returning to finish the writing program you began with your own severe desire for language, but I did. And now I'm at the end. Already, though, I'll admit to you, I'm thinking of home. I have been this whole time. Once in one of the small creeks that runs from Fort Peck Lake, I saw a catfish swimming upstream, trying to make it back to the shelter of a larger body of water. It was late summer, and there wasn't enough of the creek to cover the top half of his fins. Still, he pushed down into the mud and kept on. I did not envy him, nor did I devise some plan to help him make it back to safety. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about what type of person this makes me. And since we're on this track, I have a sister I haven't spoken to in years, and the language my relatives spoke while getting ready for the dam's inaugural ceremonies is close to extinction. But I have always made up something more important to do rather than take the risk of saving it. I am still angry at times with my father because I long for the type of mother mine could never have been. I go on mourning her, even though a medicine person has told me it was time to let her go to the other side. I wonder if she is still close, or if years ago she ignored me and went on. I could go on, tell you about my poetry, about how much it's meant to spend time with Ripley, about the influence Jim has been. Thank you for telling him to write what he knew. That allowed me to write what I know 25 years later from another res a little farther down the road.
Thank you, Mandy. And you referenced that early on, Hugo has a long series of letter poems to Jim Welch, to William Stafford, to Kittredge, to a lot of his contemporaries. And so thanks for sharing that with us. And I look forward to hearing more from all of our poets of their own work as we work through this. And I guess the next topic I'd kind of like to bring up is a few things that we saw in some of those letters and early illustrations is Russell's early life in St. Louis and the journey west. And he really made an effort to stay in touch with people throughout all of the periods in his life and went to considerable effort to maintain those ties. And I think at that time, the partings were kind of difficult and more irrevocable than they might be now. And I guess I'd like to think about contemporary leavings, and when we relocate, how do you stay in touch with people you leave behind, or do you? And how big of a part of that childhood and nostalgia stays with you through your own work?
I kind of feel guilty going first all the time, but I'll answer again.
I kind of feel grateful for you going, Chris.
I don't, and this is something maybe Robert you can relate to, or any of us who have taught. I'm not a teacher, but I have a part-time job at the bookstore downtown, and we have a couple students as co-employees, and we get all these students that come and they're here for a few years and then they leave. And I had this experience just this past weekend of someone I got to know a little bit, and I found myself on Instagram, and the first post that came up was this student that I'd interacted with talking about how, now she's left Missoula and is back in Minnesota, and what a great 2 years. And I had just such a I'm probably never going to see this person again, and that's just one example. And as easy as it is to communicate electronically, I've done what I can to really kind of disentangle myself from social media as much as I can, but that's what we rely on. And as easy as it is to keep in touch, it's almost more difficult because there's so much. If I wanted to stay in touch with this person, I would have to make a conscious effort to weed through all the garbage to keep in touch with this person, and vice versa. And I don't know, is that something that you guys struggle with as teachers? Just this constant, you get to know people over a period of years and then they're gone and they're on to the rest of their life that you're not necessarily a part of anymore. I don't know. That was the first time that really struck me, that kind of student person who stays where they came to really struck me, I guess. I don't know. And it's similar to, imagine leaving St. Louis and, 10 years later you arrive at your destination or whatever, that's kind of the running joke, but I don't know. I think we take for granted because it's so easy.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we do take it for granted, even though the reality turns out to be, as you mentioned, probably different than what we might anticipate. What about the rest of you? What do you think about that?
Well, in terms of teaching, I've been at it for decades actually, and so there are thousands and thousands of students that have passed through my life. But it's like anything else. There are certain people that stay with you and you remember them. I mean, I think back to my own days as a student in Missoula, and one of my dearest friends, we are still friends from that time, even though we've gone through periods of years at a time not communicating with each other. I find that a couple of things. One, that true friendship is fairly rare, and when you find it, sometimes you can be disconnected for a very long time and it's still present. You can pick up where it left off. And I think family ties too are like that. My grandmother and her sister didn't see each other for, I think, 14 years, which speaks to Robert's idea that those leavings were much more long-term. And so they don't know if they're, people didn't know if they were going to see each other again. And yet they picked up where they left off, and the letters continued in the meantime. So what he's doing makes a lot of sense to me, that you want certain ties to be able to continue despite the great distance.
Yeah, and I think sometimes if you're maintaining those ties as an artist, I don't know if that always has to be reciprocal, because you're sending that out and you're keeping it going, at least in your work. And I guess it's kind of evident when you sort through that correspondence, those poems, what Russell wanted to chronicle and preserve communicate or celebrate. And I guess if I think about you as poets, why is it, do you think, that verse is the most powerful structure for many subjects and for the subjects that you choose?
I think that's a complicated question. I mean, on the one hand, it can be simple in the sense that maybe it just moves on image and sound, and, you know, the musicality of it is something that we can respond to on a level that's sort of below the surface. It affects our emotions. Or that the, you know, very concise language allows us to cover a lot of ground in a short amount of space. But when I say it's more complicated, I also think that drawing precise bounds between poetry and something else there's a lot of hazy area in between. That prose can do a lot of those same things that poetry can sometimes do. And maybe it's a matter of whatever it is that wants to be communicated comes in the, you know, finds the right form for that particular communication.
Thanks, Tammy. What about the rest of you? What sends you to, I don't know, your keyboard or your tablet or whatever medium you use? I know when we had an initial discussion on this, several of you mentioned that you were very influenced by landscape, and others not quite so much. I'd just like to hear some of your thoughts on that.
I know I'm inclined toward the brevity of poetry. You know, my favorite poems tend to run short. You know, mine certainly are, but then the stuff I like. And I think I came to poetry just as a way to try and write about the places that I go, where I spend time, where I kind of re-energize in a way different than what I'd really been reading at that point, which was all prose stuff. And it just kind of happened that it came out the way it did. And I think that can be common for a lot of people. Just the simplicity of it can be attractive, in the same way that the complexity can also be attractive to other people. That's just, for me, that's just my answer to the question, is that I like them short, and I like to see just how much imagery you can cram into, or not even cram into, but just kind of summon in the mind of the reader through minimalism, I guess is the best way to put it.
Thanks, Chris. Something that Mandy brought up earlier is that Russell almost appears apologetic sometimes for his travels, and he expresses disdain for cities and his surroundings there, and homesickness for the mountains in Montana. And I just wanted to bring up the idea, at times that almost seemed a little exaggerated or contrived to me, because he made the choices to travel to New York for those annual trips. And I think Nancy Russell's drive and business acumen is evident there, but Russell was obviously the beneficiary and an equal participant in that. And I just wondered if that was playing to the audience a little bit, or if that's the case at all.
I would agree. I felt that way after looking through this book, more so now than before. Beforehand, I see him as a tourist. I mean, I guess I always knew he wasn't, but I see him as a tourist and somebody who thrives. He's kind of, I won't say whining, but kind of complaining about New York and St. Louis and traveling, but there he is doing it, and there he is documenting it. People are taking his photographs, and he's really a lot like celebrities, modern current day celebrity, a little bit. I mean, maybe not a lot like that, but I think that it didn't make me, it wasn't like I was super critical, but I noticed it. I saw him as someone who was thriving on all of that, being the one who can leave get away and travel and see the world and come back. But he was kind of, making it seem like he just was so homesick he had to get home right away. So I don't know if that's, I agree with you, Robert. I was noticing that when I flipped through this book.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at, Earl, because I know, like, I miss my home, and I talk about it like I wish I were there all the time, but most of the time I'm pretty happy to be in Missoula, and I made a choice to be here. And I think as writers, sometimes that nostalgia and homesickness is more of a muse than being in a place we purport to miss so much.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think definitely, you can tell he's a person that still loved to travel regardless. He loved those excursions and would take numerous, friends to different places in Montana and spend time with them. But it was really unexpected how sometimes it was a little exaggerated in a lot of those letters, because, the reality was, he was garnering incredible praise and fame as he made those trips around the country. I think I read somewhere that he sold a piece of artwork in the realm of like the $10,000 range, and it was the highest price ever for an American artist. So those trips, those work trips, were incredibly important to his career, but also into doing the things when he came back to Montana that he really loved. And that was, spending time in Glacier, spending time up near Cut Bank or in Pablo, really moving around the state. So that allowed him the freedom, his success from those trips gave him a certain level of freedom that he wouldn't have had otherwise as a lesser known artist. One thing that I was really struck by was in the end, how they really, both of them settled on California as a place they wanted to winter, and how enamored he was of the celebrity sort of culture that he experienced. That was, it would seem to me like those would be almost the polar opposite of, the ranch hands and, the workers and people that he cherished so much in Montana, is that he would go to Hollywood or to Los Angeles and experience almost an entirely different culture, but be kind of so taken with it. That wasn't something I had ever known or really expected.
Yeah, that was new to me in that in those sections too. Would somebody else like to share a poem now? Some of your own work as we move through the program. I'd love to hear from Tammy, Chris, or Earl.
Well, I could jump in with I have a poem when we were talking about email correspondence, and I have this really good friend of mine who is not a writer, and she's always, over the years, has ideas for me to write poems, and I bet you guys probably have friends like that as well, who say, oh, I've got an idea for you. And so I got this email a number of years ago, and somewhere back to what we were talking about earlier, I'm sure that email is buried and stored in the big box somewhere, but I don't have that on hand. But she was asking me to write a poem about, she loves recycling, and and trash drives her nuts, especially plastic. And she wanted me to write a poem about, in her email, she was telling me this, I want you to write a poem about picking up trash and putting the trash in another trash bag that you also found, and the insanity of it all. So I read this email, and it sat in my inbox for 8 or 10 months, and I just dreaded it. I didn't want to write the poem. It's not I didn't think I could ever write a poem like that. But to speed up the story, she kept asking me, have you written the trash poem? So finally, I just looked at the email again. I treated it like found material. I made a few tweaks and some reorganized. I scrapped a couple things, and this is a poem called Poem for Manda. Earl, I've been wondering for some time, actually, if you could write a poem for me about washing plastic bags. and putting these plastics in a big plastic bag that then gets put in a recycling container. I'm struck by the absolute insanity of this, and I don't know how to live with it. Very short, Chris, to your, but so yeah, I just, and elsewhere, Robert, in here you ask about departures, poems that are not normal for us. That would be an example for me. I don't do a lot of found poetry. And I didn't even consider that a very interesting or successful poem. I didn't consider it a poem. But it's funny, I've had a lot of people comment on that poem to me later, and it just makes me realize as poets, we don't always know, we think we've done something good here, and this is just a piece of trash or a light thing or something small. But I get a lot of comments on that, and I don't know. But anyway, that's it speaks to this dance, this act of receiving emails and then also writing and trying to communicate back in the form of poetry to that person. The correspondence is there, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's interesting how that just you reading that, I know that will stay with me in ways that will resonate well. And I think that's interesting. I'd like to hear from Earl or the rest of you too. I always find it interesting that we don't always know what work will resonate with somebody. And sometimes the pieces that you put so much effort into, and I think we desire that feedback, but that's not always forthcoming. And other pieces that maybe come a little more easily to us resonate more than we might expect. And what's the rest of you? What are your experiences with that, or Earl, with any other ones?
I'm always a little surprised at what has staying power and what doesn't. I mean, and I guess I just watch to see what gets anthologized after the book comes out, and maybe I've thought a poem, I should be able to get it published. I've sent it out a lot of times. Nothing comes of it. It goes into my collection, and then all of a sudden it gets anthologized, it gets picked up someplace. So it's very hard to determine. I mean, we can fool ourselves in all kinds of ways. We can think it's awful, or we can think it's really good, but it's ultimately, it has its own life. It goes out there into the world, and then it sinks or swims. I've just learned not to predict too much.
Do you think maybe we're a little predisposed to want that to be the response to be commensurate with the effort or with the...
Right. Yeah. Well, and I just think as a writer, you can fool yourself, and I can fool myself in so many ways. It's why it's a great idea not to run out right after, you've written a new poem and say, oh my God, I've written the best thing ever, right? Because usually give it a day or two and you see what you've really done back there, and that you really need to spend more time with it. Yeah, I just find it to be a slow process, and I try not to assume too much about how they'll end up, I guess.
Thanks, Tammy. I guess I'd like to ask you just a little bit, you've alluded to this briefly, but as poets, about some of your tools or your implements. And we see some of the poems and drawings that Russell did on birch bark. And I just wondered if you have any unusual implements, tools, or canvases that you employ. Whenever you give readings, I know you all get questions about your process or something, but would anybody like to weigh in on that? Do you write with pencil and paper, pen and paper, keyboard, on birch bark?
I have typed poems on birch bark before, and it works really well. I'm not kidding. I know it sounds silly, but but yes, I mean, I don't do this all the time, but around the house, I have some different poems that are, you just feed it through a typewriter and you can type on it, and it's really rewarding. It's the ink takes to that from a typewriter very well. But I'm not doing it every day.
So many napkins. I've begun so many poems on the back of a napkin. If I'm driving or I'm in a restaurant or a cafe or, at home, it seems to be always the easiest thing to grab. And I really like how if you have a good pen when you do it, it really kind of bleeds through. Something about that is just like, feeling that and sensing that is important.
When my kids were young, I did the same thing. Napkins, backs of receipts, whatever I could lay my hands on. And then sometimes I'd lose the poems. I'd stuff them in my purse. And if they surfaced and if I got them on the computer, then I had them. But some just disappeared. I tend to write by hand. I really like writing by hand.
Yeah, I think, Mandy, when we were talking about Hugo earlier, that in his wonderful little craft book, The Triggering Town, it's full of, I think, pretty solid advice. But one thing that Hugo said is that you didn't need to keep notes or write anything down, because if it was worthwhile, it would stay with you. And I don't think that's really the case. I mean, I feel like there are things I should have written down that I didn't. And I think, like, yeah, talking about those napkins and things, sometimes those are invaluable. I guess something else along those lines is Russell worked in some idyllic or beautiful places, Bullhead Lodge, Glacier, and then he has his actual studios and workplaces. And I wonder where we actually get our work done, or how that varies, and how does that process happen for you? Where are your perfect or ideal workspaces, both mental or physical, and how does that compare and or contrast with the reality of how you get your work done?
I actually have multiple spaces that I like to work in. So before the, lockdown, shut down everything, I was making a lot of progress. There's a little back table in the back of the Union Club in Missoula that there's outlets right there. So for working on my book, which is almost entirely done on my laptop, on a computer. So, and I was way more productive there than I've found myself to be sitting here, in my home where I do almost all of my writing now. But here, I get up really early and there's 2 or 3 little things that I do every day as part of my writing practice that, at dawn or before dawn, depending on what time of year it is, just, that tactile, like Tammy was talking about, writing by hand, just the scratch of the pen on the paper, and it's quiet, and then the birds start arriving right outside my window, and just all those little sensations. I absolutely love it. But, I like writing in coffee shops. I like writing in bars. I found I can write at least kind of that initial, getting the idea down almost anywhere. But I do like to be able to settle in somewhere quiet when I'm really trying to, capital W work, as opposed to just kind of gathering all the material, whether it ends up on the page or not. But yeah, public or private.
Well, I guess one thing that's kind of interesting about Russell is he managed to support himself through his work from a relatively early age. And I think it's always interesting how artists, poets, writers, how do you support yourself in addition to your work? And I know, Earl, you shoe horses. Chris, you mentioned working in a bookstore. Mandy and Tammy are both involved in education. And I guess, how does that both support you in the obvious ways, but also as artists? How does that inform your work?
You know, in some ways, it interferes. It takes up an awful lot of my time that I might like to be spending in writing other things. But it's also really rewarding. I always have new information coming in and new ideas, and I learn from my students. So it's both of those things at once. And I think sometimes that tension is really important. Like I do more when I'm busier, sometimes I can procrastinate on a task I need to do at work by finishing a poem, and vice versa. So it's like I kind of zigzag my way along and try to, meet all obligations. So that it can be really kind of energizing, I think.
I think the work that I do in education is a little different. I'm not working with students, on a day-to-day basis, but really trying to advocate and push for a stronger education system that meets more kids' needs, particularly native children. That it's really, really draining and sometimes really, really hard. And so I agree with Tammy that it can really pull my energy, and even sometimes your sense of hope or belief or faith, whatever you want to call it. But then on the other side of that is I do have poetry to go to almost as a retreat from those feelings, and really able to feel somewhat rejuvenated, reconnected, to the bigger picture and things that really matter. So without it, I'd probably just be a shell, trying to do my day-to-day work. So it's something I need really to balance.
I talk about the bookstore gig, kind of, that's my freelance career. I feel like what I make over 3 days a week working in a bookstore is, roughly the equivalent of maybe what I could hope to make chasing articles in various disappearing magazines, because it works on a couple levels. I think all of you, except maybe Mandy, we've spent time standing in that bookstore chatting, and I would never be able to do that if I was the recluse that I like to imagine myself being. So, I think working there 3 days a week, I get socialization that I would not get otherwise among people who can relate to what it is that makes me tick as a writer and wanting to do that kind of work. It enables me to have some guaranteed income without trying to convince editors why my story idea is the greatest thing and they should put it on the cover and all that stuff. It just takes a lot of that kind of pressure of having to chase income that I kind of expected I would be doing when I left my old job to just devote myself to writing. So, like I think Tammy said, the two are so intertwined. They're almost inseparable in some ways. And that creates problems at other times as well, just for the sheer energy that more socialization. I recognize I need some, but it is often too much, and the energy drain that takes. So it's a constant, juggling match or tug of war, or whatever metaphor you want to use. But again, it has been very important to what I'm doing as a writer.
Thanks, Chris. What about your work as a farrier, Earl, and an exceptional farrier, by the way, too? How does that take away or inform and add to your work?
Well, I think the main thing that I notice all the time, and especially during June, July, and August, is just the amount of work is so much that I'm physically exhausted. Like right now is sort of what I tell people is the peak or the height of me feeling not like a poet. I mean, I do not feel, I'm not reading, I'm not writing much. So this symposium is actually, I think it's slightly more difficult to have these discussions now than maybe during the winter for me, because I come home and I'm physically so shot that I think I need a day to rest and then another day to kind of get into the zone. And then John Ashbery has that quote that is kind of an annoying, it aggravates a lot of poets, but it's the trouble with being a poet is knowing what to do with the other 23 and a half hours of the day. And when I first heard that, I thought he's joking. Then later I thought, no, he's not really joking that much. There's a little bit of truth to that, like the warm-up time, the reading, you get your coffee, you get your space, you ease into this place, and the actual poem sometimes happens or quickly, but anyway, it'll come back to me later, in the fall when work will slow down. But as far as do I find inspiration at work, I think while I'm actually working, I'm trying really hard not to access the poet in me when I'm communicating with horse people. I just try to keep it separate. So I don't know. I think I'm sure it does inform my poetry, but not in a real obvious way. I can't say, boy, I have some great ideas when I'm under this horse. Really what I'm thinking is, where is my bottle of ibuprofen? Did I leave it is it in the glove box, or is it, and I go in that direction, and I'm not really thinking about writing at all, but.
Thanks.
Yeah.
What about another poem from one of you now?
I could read one. We were talking about lodges and special places a bit ago, and I have one that I wrote, I can pull it up here, about Swan Lake. Well, sort of, it's where it took place. And I have relatives there, I stay there with them sometimes. And this was the last visit, probably in, well, it was in September. Do I romanticize the bear? Mist on the lake, a fact of air and water in September, apple season, late chokecherry season. A grizzly on the shore, no real surprise, its powerful ambling. It wades in a few steps, lowers its snout to drink, wanders through a dark cluster of pine, then back to shore. I want to go out, but stay in the cabin's warmth. If I were alone, I would venture, not enough to make fear or danger, but to inhabit the same air, the same circle of morning. What does it mean, if it must mean anything, this good fortune to see a grizzly so soon after dawn? And then a single swan, its slow and dreamy paddle.
Thank you, Tammy. And we've talked about Russell's travels a little bit and maybe how that informed his work. And I'd just like to throw it out and see what travels or experience inform your work or add to it. And I think sometimes it takes a certain amount of retrospective to recognize that. But what travels or residencies have you done that have had lasting impact on your work that maybe you didn't even recognize right at the time you were experiencing it?
So this is a question I actually made a note of to respond to as I was reading through this, because I would say, unknowing at the time, that the job I left that required a lot of travel is literally the reason I'm sitting here right now. Because going back to talking about our work just taking all of our energy to where we can't write poems or whatever our discipline is, that was the case that I had with this old job. And I had gotten to the point where I keep these journals that I carry with me all the time. And I just decided I'm going to write at least a sentence a day, just to feel like no matter where I am or what I'm doing, I've done just this one thing that moves the practice of my craft forward without any intention of ever really doing anything beyond that. And time passes, and I've told this story a million times about, reading Jim Harrison and Ted Kuzer's Braided Creek, a conversation in poetry, where they were sending postcards back and forth while Kuzer was recovering from cancer treatment. And I read that book and saw the way that they just had these short little 2 to 8 line poems. And when I saw that, the light bulb went on over my head. And I thought, if I take these sentences that I've accumulated, cull all the crap, because there was a lot of that, and kind of reconfigure these things into short little poems, maybe I'll have something. And that is ultimately what led to the book that I published that, and here we are today. I never would have imagined that the very thing that I thought was keeping me from being a writer at all would be the thing that would kind of light the fuse for the work that would kind of put me where I was wanting to be in the first place. Just writing and sharing with other writers and doing things like this and doing readings and workshops and stuff like that. It was totally unexpected. And it wasn't until it was almost exactly 2 years ago Saturday was when I did my release event at Fact and Fiction, expecting, my mom and a couple employees, and the place is full. And I'm like, wow, all of this stuff that I hated so much while it was happening is why I'm doing this right now. So the definite correlation between the two.
Would you share something from that now with us, Chris?
From that?
Well, anything. It seems like a good time to get a reading from you.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to read a new thing. Because as everybody was reading their location poems, I realized that everything that I'd selected to potentially have to read are kind of, tied to place, and in particular, like the neighborhood that I live in. And this is one. I'm going to read this one. It came out of a prompt, a book of daily prompts that I started doing. The book tells you on this date, think about writing about this. And most of the time you just kind of throw it out. But this one ended up being a place poem called The Patrons. The patron saint of abundant cigarettes hunkers down under the cardboard bin in the alley behind Butterfly Herbs, where offerings to them are made 24/7 in all kinds of weather, from travelers who make the pilgrimage from every point on the compass. Inside, the patron saint of the random playlist spins tunes with abandon, sometimes to distract, but usually to entertain the gathering of poets, artists, and bullshitters who cluster nearby to weave their yarns or to huddle alone, warm and safe on a cold morning in November. Meanwhile, in the hinterlands, the touchdown Jesus of Council Grove really isn't Jesus at all, but is instead the patron saint of wandering great blue herons who congregate here year-round to fish, breed, and be majestic beneath his beneficent arms. I would like to be known as the patron saint of patron saints, the weirder the better, spreading the word of their existence, proselytizing for worshipers, carving and placing icons in their images to be stumbled on by those who need to find them.
Thank you, Chris. In a couple of Russell's poems, His Heart Sleeps, it's a poem and it's in calligraphy. He uses a more formal structure, a rhyme scheme and form. And I'd just like to ask you as poets, how important is form in your work and your writing process? And at what point is the composition, is it revealed to you? Is it imposed? Do you think in form, or do you put form on after you kind of have something down?
I have some things to say about this, if that's okay. Form is really important to me, but I don't think any kind of poem is formless. In other words, I think, you know, free verse, whatever it looks like on the page, there's a certain form at work. We have received forms and then, you know, open forms that people create. And so I think it's a melding of, I think a couple things. One is that it's a kind of melding of whatever the topic is with whatever the best way it is to reveal that topic. But I also, personally, I kind of trained myself in received forms. So they were a conscious imposition first. I wanted to know how to do them well, and so I'd write in whatever the form was once a day for a week or two. And at that point, I think they go into a less conscious place. And so what happens after that, at least in my experience, is that sometimes I'll write something and say, oh, look, you know, it took this shape. So it happens sort of less deliberately, or I recognize that with a little tweaking, it could be shaped into a sonnet or something like that.
Thanks, Tammy. What about the rest of you?
The only form I ever write in specifically is haiku. I write a lot of haiku. I think, for one thing, I don't really know forms beyond haiku. And the nature of kind of writing in these small little notebooks is that sometimes I really can't think too much about the line just because of the space. It's not like writing on a full page where I can kind of see it. I don't know. It's not until I take it off the notebook and transcribe it either into a larger notebook or, you know, into the word processor or something where I can really see if this thing is taking more space than just a solid block of text. Haiku is different because, you know, you're dealing with very small lines. Even the longer lines are small. So that's my approach to form. A, not knowing what any forms are, and B, kind of limiting myself by what the medium I typically work in.
Thanks, Chris. I'd like to move on just a little bit. In the letter to Judge Charles Prey and the accompanying drawings of Russell's with that, he acknowledges some complicity in native displacement and the perception of the frontier. And I'd just like to know if anybody wants to address that as a theme in Russell's work at all that we've examined.
I mean, I had so many feelings and thoughts about this question. You know, we can describe it as the frontier, but you know, really it was an eastward invasion of sorts. You know, it was settler colonialism that was, you know, changing this landscape, you know, really forever. You know, and knowing that Judge Prey and Russell himself, you know, self-described as Native American advocates, really. You know, in some ways it, you know, was very, very different from that. You know, as I was thinking about Russell's influence and impact really on Indian country, not so much Indian country itself, because I'm sure many people were unaware that he even, you know, was creating his art and using natives and the landscape as their home as important themes. But I think, you know, part of what ensued as, you know, with his work, you know, really was, you know, he really, I think, saw Native Americans as almost like a vanishing race. You know, the noble savage was a really prominent theme at the time. And that really, you know, kind of romanticizing plains tribes in a lot of ways. I think for the rest of America, really kind of helped to cement like a monolithic, that we were a monolithic culture of Native Americans across the country. So people couldn't really see beyond that for a very, very long time. It still endures, today. So while I'm appreciative of many of those paintings, my personal favorite of his is When the Land Belonged to God. I can stare at that in the Montana Historical Society, seeing those bison come up over that ridge, and just thinking of that title, how remarkable it is. But, part of his influence was, helped to open the door sometimes to the stereotypes and false narratives. And again, that idea of a monolithic culture, unintentionally, but that's, part of what happened, part of the story.
Thanks, Mandy. And I also think it's interesting, like when I say frontier there, I'm thinking of it in quotations, but I think it's also interesting that the period that Russell captured and wished to, mythologize in some ways was a snapshot. I mean, like the cowboy culture in those paintings and stuff, that was a brief period, but yet, we place it kind of prominently in his work and in our idea of this region or this culture. And I think it's in a much broader context.
Robert, this is one of those questions where I didn't answer right away because I have a tendency to monologue on this one because and Mandy put it very well in how he kind of helped create this mythology of this monolithic plains culture. And my native culture is not, we're on the high plains, and we, we're largely invisible in Russell's work, though, there were certainly plenty of Métis, we were called breeds back then, half-breeds. We're certainly among the cowboys, among the ranchers, the sheep ranchers. And I look at some of this artwork, like in the 1896, 1897, early 1900s. And, it's one of those things, in the region where he was living in Great Falls, in 1896, the United States passed the Cree Deportation Act. And what that was, is it was 10 years after there'd been a rebellion in Canada where the Métis were trying to establish a homeland. Louis Riel and was the leader of this uprising, and they were crushed. And there were many refugees that fled, to us, it was all one land. We didn't recognize any border. The medicine line was just something that the colonialists had created. But, like all along the Front Range there, outside of Choteau, there was a lot of refuge taken there. Towns like Lewistown was founded by Métis people, and a lot of people in Great Falls. In 1896, out of Fort Assiniboine, up outside of Havre, if anybody knows anything about what happened there, they know that the Buffalo Soldiers were there, which was the African American 10th Cavalry Regiment. And the guy who went on to become Black Jack Pershing, the overall commander of Allied forces in World War I, led this 10th Cavalry. That's how he got his name Blackjack, because it was a black regiment and he was a white guy. But what they were doing is the Cree Deportation Act of 1896. The government called for all of the mixed race natives living north of the Missouri River to be rounded up, loaded on cattle cars, and sent back to Canada, because they said these are Canadian Indians, which was not true. We were living there all along. And like I look at these pictures of Russell with this, Thoroughman's home on the range, 1897, this little cabin. Chances are that was a Métis family's cabin who'd gotten rounded up, shipped out, and the settlers just moved in when they weren't burned. So there's this huge period of history that nobody knows about, and that is very frustrating as someone who descends from those people. You know, my great great grandmother was born in 1896 in Roy, Montana, and I always ask myself, were they rounded up and had to, you know, make their way back? I don't know. That sometimes, in order to kind of face the way history is portrayed and these luminaries that we talk about from that period in time, I have to like build this wall to be able to appreciate them for their contribution to the culture we live in today, yet somehow also having to realize that, but what about all this stuff that somewhere along the lines we decided we don't want anybody to know about? And it's that juggling that is frustrating, and that doesn't often come out in my work because I don't really want to be the angry Indian poet, but then there are times that it does. And the current history that we see, like the way we're treating people on the southern border of the United States right now, where we're dividing up families and shipping some people back and putting people in cages, that's what happened to us. And for us to determine how we want to be moving forward, we need to come to grips with that. That's something we've been doing all the time. And at what point do we stop? And that's what a lot of this kind of stirs up in me.
Thanks, Chris. I guess, Earl, you read a piece earlier, a poem that you said was kind of a departure from your own work. And I think we see that in the poem to Paris Gibson, which is noted as a departure, a turnabout from Russell's usual subjects and sentiments. And he lived in Great Falls, even as he was celebrating the ranching and rural, rustic, old-time ways. So those things had kind of changed even then. And I guess, do you feel like you have consistent themes and subjects? And does anybody else, or Earl, anyone, want to share a poem that you feel like might be kind of a departure or outlier from the majority of your work?
Well, I can what I've been doing recently, like I said, I'm not doing a lot of writing during the summer, but I still am writing poems. One thing I enjoy doing is picking something that just seems like completely banal subject. So I'll read a poem that I wrote. This is called Shelter in Place, because I sit there and I think I've written Dr. Fauci poems, Shelter in Place poems, and they're almost like challenges to myself, because I think I don't have any ideas. I'm just going to see what happens. This is a recent poem, well, from the maybe April or May, called Shelter in Place. Snow in yard looks fake coming down, or maybe digital, above reality, staged somehow and moving slower than snow should. Big red chairs getting snowed on, snowed past, cinematic. And wet books on porch getting wetter, geez. You say you like to think your old bike might talk to the canoe in the garage when we're not there, that even the dust has thoughts, but it doesn't. The garage is a vacuum. You stir your drink with your finger, looking almost wall-eyed for a sec. I've shaved my beard just as you start growing yours. Why don't we make our own jigsaw puzzles, you say, before we sit down to work on them? I reach over and stir your drink with my finger as loads of ennui course quietly from one cold end of the house to the other.
Thanks, Earl.
Yeah. I don't know if that, answered or played into that question exactly or not, but yeah, Shelter in Place is a recent poem.
No, I think it played in perfectly. Maybe we can just kind of go down the line and hear another poem from each of you.
Well, I've got myself all stirred up, so I'll read one of my angry poems. This one is called Holy, and it's after the Wallace Stevens quote that says, "The poet is the priest of the invisible." If a poet is a priest, then I guess it is time to quit writing poems, because I don't aspire to be the leader, spiritual or otherwise, of anything. To say nothing of the baggage that comes attached to such a word, like a bloated and infected tick, spreading sickness and slow, painful death. Tell me where any priest has ever gone where the soul's already there or any better off for it. I prefer my poems, like my spirit, to lean more heathen, away from any notion of robe-wearing devils preaching salvation from behind the muzzles of colonial rifles disguised as scripture. Justify the missionaries' existence all you want, but first acknowledge they're invisible, those unmarked graves left in their wake. Of course, it was some high-minded, self-important aristocrat who sought to sanctify his literary efforts, but come on, these poems are words. A spell, certainly for some, a refuge even for others. My people have no use for the ivory towers and glossy pages that vomit forth that brand of pretentious self-reference. Go build a fence. Spend a couple days with a shovel in hand. Watch all of your efforts wither under the onslaught of a relentless sun. Tell me then what is holy.
Thank you, Chris. Let's hear from Mandy and Tammy, and then we'll move on and give you another chance to address a few of the letters.
Well, this might be a poem that they could insert even earlier when they edit. I'm just saying this so they hear it, because you were asking about landscape, and I am definitely the guilty party when you asked that question about what inspires us, and that, you know, it was me that had said, you know, landscape and all that's there. I guess I'm like a landscape junkie. And I'm really inspired by place in multiple ways. But I was thinking about Russell and you know, his travels from Great Falls out to Lake McDonald must have taken him along, I'm guessing, the Rocky Mountain front, and, you know, into the park from the east side entrance there. Maybe not, but just knowing that he would have, you know, probably made that path. I'm not familiar of or aware of any artwork that he might have painted of that side of the park, but, you know, I'm sure we've all seen it, and it's so incredibly breathtaking and remarkable. You know, the backbone of the world, as the Blackfeet call it, which I think suits it perfectly. But in a lot of my work travels, that's times when poetry kind of comes up for me. And I was doing a lot of work in Blackfeet country, in particular in Heart Butte, Montana, which is a wonderful community, really, really great people there, and a really great school with kids and educators, you know, doing what they do. But I was just struck when, you know, the many times that I drove to Heart Butte over seasons, many seasons and years, you know, the silhouette of the mountain range remained the same, but so much within it and around it, and the time of day or year, different shades of grass and trees and snow or not snow. And so I wrote a poem which is called Heart Butte, Montana. And as I was thinking of things I might read today, I just thought of this one because, again, I could just imagine Russell kind of moving across that landscape and maybe possibly, you know, noticing some of the same things that I have in my time up there. So this is called Heart Butte, Montana. The unsympathetic wind, how she has evaded me for years now, leaving a guileless shell and no way to navigate. Once when I stood on a plateau of earth just at the moment before the dangerous jutting peaks converged upon the lilting sway of grasslands. I almost found a way back. There, the sky, quite possibly all the elements, caused the rock and soil and vegetation to congregate. Their prayer was not new, and so faint I could hardly discern. Simple remembrances, like a tiny syncopated chorus calling everyone home, across 1,000 eastward miles, and what little wind was left at my back. But I could not move, and then the music was gone. All that was left were the springtime faces of mountains, gazing down, their last patches of snow, luminous. I dreamed of becoming snow melt, gliding down the slope and into the valley, with the promise and assurance that there is always a way to become bird, tree, water again.
Thank you, Mandy. That's a great place to share that. So I guess I'd just like to give all of you the opportunity now to read a poem that maybe doesn't have to tie into the discussion, or just what you'd most like to share with us today.
I can read a poem. You were asking about earlier about whether our work is taking a new direction, or whether we've done things that are out of character. I've always, had rattlesnakes and bears and things in my books, and I always say, that's it. They're not going to show up again, and they always show up again. And I guess that's just what happens. I grew up with rattlesnakes out on the prairie. So, but this one is not about that, but a bear shows up again. This is called Deer on Crazy Creek. And this is a creek on top of the Beartooth Plateau, so very high up. And I'm speaking to the deer. Actually, the deer is the listener in this poem, theoretically. And I make reference to this story by Leslie Marmon Silko called Yellow Woman. And in that story, there's a woman who is kind of going about her business. She's outside, and this guy rides up on a horse, and he takes her into this very high place. And you find out that he's sort of taking her into this worldly place. And I think sometimes it's easy when you're alone in the mountains to feel like, you've stepped into the past, or you've stepped into something else. Deer on Crazy Creek. Along the trail, I think how risky the venture, the signs that say don't go alone into bear country. I can see miles except in aspen. Walking uphill in sage, I think of Yellow Woman, of the stranger who finds her and takes her into another life. It's after that, after coming from a grove of trees, I climb on a huge split boulder and watch an ant navigate a forest of lichens. When I raise my eyes to the horizon, I see you, the way you hold your head, ambling along the trail, the sway of your body on this path made long before humans managed and mapped this place. You are doing what we do, head down, step ahead, step ahead. When you look up and I begin to speak, you stop, deciding whether to bolt or continue, a turn for us both. I wonder, do your thoughts go to the bear at the edge of the mind, the long trail with golden butterflies on sage, flies that chase and bite? Do you understand what calls and calls again from an aspen horizon?
Thank you, Tammy. Another poem.
I could read one more. This is lately, I have trouble sleeping. A lot of times I'll get up around 1:30 or 2 in the morning and end up writing. And this is a poem called Preparing for Sleep. I lay in the dark on my side, thinking about the different sides that I'm aware of. The side of a horse, the side of a ship, old iron sides, a side of beef, a side of slaw, big spoon of mac and cheese, and its subsequent ramekin. Then ramekin production, the glazing of ramekins, the inspections and the bubble wrap. I extend one foot out from under the covers, the cover of night, the album's cover, the barbecues, its rustic joie de vie beneath waxed cotton canvas duck. If it looks like a duck, walks and quacks like one, it might be a goose. The goose who crossed the road, why did he do it? And later the goose confit, meat in its own fat, a fat lip, a fat knee, the fatness of cats who, I retract my foot, can't fit through the door. Not just cat doors, but any door that groans a bit, any door that vibrates, the old door of redemption, the door of deep feeling.
Thank you, Earl.
Yeah.
Another poem from anyone?
I'll do another one, Robert. This one's called 40-Degree Plunge. Curtains open to charcoal light at 7 a.m. and juncos cling to frozen branches. The rear tires of a hoopty churn and slide through smooth drifts collecting at the hard right corner of the street, snow still falling on my neighborhood. In the kitty corner driveway, a hulking black Chevy rumbles, billowing clouds of hot exhaust, swept away on the gusts of wind that doubles over the blue spruce and blasts snow sideways, first in one direction, then the next. I go outside with wet hair under my cap and my beard freezes crispy. 2 rabbits huddled under my front porch don't so much as shudder as I pass. I wonder about the young woman next door with the 5 kids and 2 broken cars. Is she still in tears for the man cuffed and shoved yesterday afternoon into the back of a deputy's cruiser, one of 3 in the street before our homes, parked so they blocked all of us in when the air was still and the temperature was at least 40 degrees warmer? We won't thaw out all week.
Thank you, Chris.
This won't come as a surprise, but this is another place poem. Back on my reservation of Fort Peck, our family's home is on a creek that flows into the Missouri, and most people call it Frog Creek, but in Assiniboine, it's Tabecha Wakpa. So this is called Meditations at Tabecha Wakpa. 1. We have taken the long highway home again. The grass is tall. Cobwebs and the husks of yellow jackets ornament the basement. While we were away, our friend and neighbor who always invited us over for salmon and potatoes died in his sleep on the couch. 2 healthy babies had been born, twins and nephews. Someone broke in through a window downstairs, took 3 televisions, 2 star quilts, a Pendleton shawl, the chainsaw, and 1 large bottle of laundry detergent. They smoked cigarettes on the couch and drank pop from the fridge. 2. The way the horizon bends itself around our lives here might make us think we are exceptional. Walking the giant plain, wind-drenched, we found the fox kits we had been watching the previous summer. Small bodies at the bottom of the open well, probably at play, lost their bearings, and still too young to know any better. 3. Almost as ghosts, we come and go from this place, not at all like the known spirits who reside here, some at tranquil rest, others. One white man who died here 50 years ago poisoned his young wife, and raised their newborn son in a neglectful and angry home. The boy grew up neglected and angry and killed his father. Oh, the sum of these moments and our own, atoms and particles in constant motion, peel back their stratum, hang them on the clothesline in the breeze. Let their shadow shapes build nests, finally out in the open.
Thank you, Mandy. If we kind of go in chronological order with the letters and the poems, we kind of come to Merry Christmas to you and yours, the New Year's greetings, and the final holiday greetings of Russell's. And in those, I see a theme of appreciation and gratitude, but there's also an element of the elegy. And if we think about, all the things that are ephemeral and passing, I guess I want to know, what are your goals for going forward as poets, as artists, as activists? And I'd just like to hear what you see coming next for you. And I guess if we're thinking about appreciation and gratitude, this has been a tough few months. So I'd like to know something that you might be thankful or grateful for.
So in terms of gratitude, despite the lockdown, I think I've been really grateful. Obviously, we're lucky to be living in Montana and lucky to be able to get outside. I'm grateful for all of that. I've lived here in this neighborhood where I walk along the edge of the rim rocks for many years, and only this year have I started to really notice the ravens' nests. Somehow I missed them before, and have learned some, little things about animals that I see along the way, and I'm always grateful for those opportunities to learn. In terms of my work, this has been churning for some time, but I've always been interested in, how the land affects us and how our ancestry affects us. And then when I think of ancestry, it's so expansive. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger with each generation. And I've been really interested in that. The stories we're told about where we come from and our origins, and then what we discover. If you go back far enough, we find ourselves interrelated. And so I've been pursuing some of this, and in relation to these more expansive themes, which have also to do with migrations and landings and, being nomadic and then settling and then reemerging to go other places. I seem to be gravitating towards prose poetry to kind of contain more of this. So I guess that's what I have to offer.
Thanks, Tammy. On down the line, anything from Earl, Mandy, or Chris?
Well, if I wait any longer, I'll forget what the question was to begin with. So, the work that I'm most dedicated to here, probably over the next year, 2 years, is, prose. It's a memoir. So when it comes to poetry, I'm grateful that it's something that I started practicing, because it gives me an outlet to be creative without feeling like there's any real pressure on it. If I write something good that people like, that's just a side benefit for having done anything at all. So, creatively, that's important to me. With all the illness and the horrible things going on culturally, I'm grateful that I'm surrounded by people who know how to love across gender and race and economic status, and all of the things that it seems like there are certain people that think there's not room for anybody different than a certain shade and a certain political outlook. So I'm really grateful that I am surrounded by so many people who are willing to love everybody. At the same time, as terrible as things are, I'm also grateful that, there are signs of progress. A couple of weeks ago, a sportscaster used a homophobic slur on a hot mic during a game, and he was out of a job before the game was even over. And it's hard to imagine that kind of thing could have happened even 5 years ago. 5 years ago, there probably would have been a debate for 2 weeks as to whether he should be suspended at all. And yet, the guy loses his gig, as he should. He should be free to say that, but he should also be free to suffer the ramifications of having said that. So, as terrible as it seems like we are in this country culture, there's still signs that we have moved forward, and that if we just keep pushing, we can maybe move this thing even farther forward. That's about it, because it's hard sometimes to find gratitude in the midst of the news of the day. But if you look, and it's worth looking, I think it's there.
Thanks, Chris. Anyone else?
I think that's a great. That idea that the task is to see the positive, the slivers of positive that are there when you flick on the radio or the television, or everything just seems to be going in the opposite direction. I really appreciate that, because what I've been trying to do is just be more present, which I know sounds super basic, but but yeah, I love that idea of focusing on the positive instead of always. I tend to just look at the negative, and I'll get with friends and we go down this hole. And in terms of something, earlier I made this comment, like horseshoeing is just me looking for my ibuprofen bottle, but actually I'm very grateful for this job where I go out and step out in the outdoors, and I drive stop to stop and interact with animals. I interact with the horses, and they're so honest. And I'm not saying people are not honest, but dogs, horses, animals are. It's really rewarding to be able to work with these great animals, and I think about that a lot. I feel like I'm lucky to be able to spend time with animals. Maybe it steadies me a little bit more when I come back and turn on the radio. Anyway.
Thanks, Earl. Mandy, do you want to close us out with that theme?
I think, initially I was incredibly grateful for the pause. I'd been doing a lot of travel and doing a lot of work around the country, and just being able to be home, and to reconnect and spend time doing some things that I hadn't really been able to do for a while was really important. But there were several hard parts to it. Not being able to see my dad or go home to Fort Peck for almost 6 months, longest stretch I've gone in many, many years, decades. And so when I finally did get to go travel with my son across the state, it felt new. It felt like an adventure, even though we've traveled that road and been through Great Falls and Havre and Malta, Glasgow many, many times. I looked at it a little differently, and I was a little more appreciative, and driving onto our property and our home, and getting that first hug from my dad. Those are things you feel incredibly thankful for. But then also, at the same time, we've moved into a period of social unrest that has me, you know, a lot of times feeling, you know, somewhat disconnected and isolated and frustrated that, you know, I can't be doing more to support, you know, those causes of, you know, eliminating inequities, you know, really fighting the good fight, you know, not being able to do that in the ways that, you know, we typically would, you know, that's hard. And engaging with those topics, you know, is something, is work, you know, that I think for most of us is, you know, really important.
Thank you, Mandy. And I guess I'll just have to say one thing that I'm thankful and grateful for is for the four of you, for your presence here today, for your work, for your strong voices, for sharing your work with us. And I've appreciated this opportunity to look at Charlie Russell's lasting legacy and maybe giving a little bit more attention to the written work. And I hope that that prompts people to explore that and consider it a little bit more. And I'd like to thank the C.M. Russell Museum for giving us this opportunity to gather and have this discussion. And I sure look forward to seeing all of you in person soon. And take good care. And thanks again. Anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to address or in the way of wrapping up?
I'd like to say thank you to you, Robert. Thanks for managing all of this, and I really appreciate it. And thanks to the museum and Emily and Eileen.
Yeah, I had a lot of help from the museum and a lot of help from all of you. It's been a pleasure to do this. So thank you.